Welcome to Grief Uprooted, a podcast dedicated to sharing your grief stories. Together, we embark on the mystery of one's grief journey as they learn to live, heal, and be courageous in a world rooted in trauma. Join myself, Christine, in an open discussion to help you uproot the grief in all our lives. I am an award-winning author, professional speaker, and humanitarian in the field of grief and trauma. I want you to be part of the discussion. Welcome back to Grief Uprooted. I'm your host, Christine Durnetter-Landon. Today's episode is not anyone's story, but yours. Today, I have reached over 50 episodes of Grief Uprooted. I've been in this industry for 24 years, and today is all about you. And what I want to do is talk about the 7 stages of grief for 2024. Not the 7 stages of grief that was created in the 70s and then the 80s. I want to talk about grief in today's world. 7 stages of grief, not for a person who is all of a sudden having to accept their own death, but someone like you who's tuning in and trying to figure out, how do I live this life without the person that I love? So let's start, let's dive in, and this is all about you. We're going to reflect on some of the people that we met, and they will be examples of these 7 stages of grief. And you can go back and listen to that episode, reflect on it, see how it affects you. And together, we're going to walk this path and this journey. I'm so excited for this episode because I believe after a year of doing Grief Uprooted and 24 years behind me, that together we can grieve and together we can heal. Let's go. Okay, let's just dive in. I'm going to try to be concise and clear with this. So the 7 stages of grief at the end of 2024. We're entering into 2025 and I think about a week. But I want to equip you with some knowledge and help you down this path. This year might have been a tough one for you, and the years to come might be even tougher. But I truly believe, after all the research, after all the podcasts I've done this year, and the experts that we've had on, those who are grieving that I've had on, I really, truly believe that we can do this, but only together, not alone, together. So let's start. The first stage of grief, disbelief. During this stage, you might find yourself repeatedly thinking, this can't be happening. I can't believe they're gone. When we listened to some of the episodes we had, there were so many times when I said, how did your grief impact you? Like when you received that death notification. And the nature of disbelief is somewhat of a mechanical mechanism within our brain that kind of filters information that's coming towards us. Sometimes it's we can't consume everything that we're hearing at that moment. So you have this state where you're like, this can't be happening to me. It just can't be. And this repeatedly can be going on and on and on. And what I mean by that on and on and on is like for days. It's not something that you're just all of a sudden, you hear it and you're in such a state of disbelief, which you could affiliate with the word shock. But disbelief, it has an emotional numbness to it, and a confusion and disorientation to it, and an aspect of denial. And that's quite different than just being shocked by something. So some of the recognizing symptoms of disbelief are exactly what I just said, that emotional numbness, confusion and disorientation, and denial. That is a huge one where a lot of our guests have reflected on the fact they just could wake up the next morning and go, this can't be true. This must have been a dream. Another one is shock, the physical symptoms that people were feeling. This I found very interesting during the 24 years, but to actually be able to witness people's stories and have those professionals on to back up some of the things that I've been researching over the last 24 years is the physical shock to the body. That was really one aspect of grief that no one's ever really recognized, that our physical body and our spiritual body um, is really impacted by grief. How do we cope with disbelief? Allow yourself to feel. This is a hard one because we should allow ourselves to pull in the emotions and just sit with them. They're very difficult to deal with. But in disbelief, it's a gradual acceptance that this is truth. This did happen. And your mind has this amazing mechanism to only let you feel and receive what you can handle. Um, and so just sitting with those emotions. The other is seek support. Listen to this podcast, join a group. You may need to find it's kind of a discovery stage here where you may need to know all the details. And that's okay too. Being able to ruminate and seek those details. Create a routine, establish a daily routine. It can provide that sense of normalcy when you're really in this stage of grief. Um, and that routine kind of brings back some sort of normalcy to that disbelief of what's happening to you. Engage in gentle activities. Um, don't don't expect yourself to run out and start, running back to work and doing all this stuff and filling your brain with all sorts of things. Do activities that bring you peace, that allow you to slowly accept this disbelief. And really, it's okay at this stage to go, maybe I need to seek some help. Maybe I need to talk to a friend. Maybe I need to go, is this real? Can this possibly be happening? Then, I would like to add in what would we do as this happens? Like, what is the process of this? Um, a lot of times with the stages of grief, we get told, this is it. And, you know, you're just going to go through this stage and go to the next. It doesn't work that way. Um, as we've heard through the podcast, grief is integrated. It doesn't go away. It isn't something like we through a stage and then we go to the next. It's kind of a circular effect that we may continue to spin through a little bit, like that pinwheel I've talked about. And that's okay. That's how it works. But how do we gradually become to that acceptance and that integration? Um, and what happens is you become increased emotional awareness. You begin to feel a broader range of emotions. We see this so much in the podcast where people started to talk about, you know, all of a sudden I started to feel things I never felt before. And I think that's part of disbelief because you're like, what is this emotion? You feel things that people, in society, we hear emotions sad, happy, joyful, angry. No one tells you about immense sorrow. No one tells you about, how anxiety comes in when you're grieving. There's all these ranges of emotion. So it's like your emotional intelligence becomes hyper aware. The next is when you start to realize that disbelief is starting to integrate into who you are, you start engaging with life again. You start going, okay, this has happened, and what do I want to bring? What am I bringing to this daily routine? And another element that a lot of people started to do with disbelief when we started to realize that people were starting to go, this really happened to me, the reflection and meaning. They spent more time on your loved one's life and the impact that it had. So it's a lot of reflection when we start to come to the end of this stage or processing of disbelief. And one of the episodes that I really felt this in was episode 25. And it was essentially based on suicide. And the title is Grief Uprooted, YouTube channel, episode 25. I'm going to read this so I make sure I get it right. Preparing my best friend's body for the funeral. Lila shares the raw and real story of her best friend's completing suicide 5 months ago. So she came on Grief Uprooted. The grief was so fresh. It was only 5 months after her friend had completed suicide. Now, she was a death doula, and in her state of Montana, they allowed her to prepare her friend's body. And Kelly had completed suicide, and she really, her disbelief really took her somewhere where she just could not believe this was possible. Kelly, her best friend, had contemplated or spoke or hinted, but Layla was completely in disbelief and shock. And one of the ways that she integrated this and went fast was to prepare her friend's body. Episode 25. I really think the episode does reflect on how strong and the ability of our mind, body, and spirit to process the most horrific story you've ever heard. Losing a loved one, um, it's immense sorrow. We spoke about this so many times on Grief Uprooted, but in this stage of disbelief, through all of this, it's been fascinating how the mind, body, and spirit are truly programmed to cope with grief. They really are. You know, so many people say, I can't do it. I can't cope with this. But you're doing it right now. So disbelief truly is that first stage of grief. When we move on to the second stage of grief, it's called grasping grief. Moving from disbelief to grasping grief involves coming to term with the permanency, I can't say that, I'm going to try again, permanence of absence. The realization often triggers a wave of intense emotions that can feel overwhelming. When we get to grasping, you'll find in the first stage of disbelief, you have these waves that kind of come through. And those waves are really you grasping the grief, you being able to explore this transition from disbelief to grasping. It's like you're embracing the reality of what's happening. You really have no choice. The body, mind, and spirit, in so many of our stories we've heard over the last year, it guides you from that disbelief right to grasping. And you just see it happening while you're witnessing their stories. And they start to acknowledge their feelings. So some of the things navigating the emotional turmoil of grasping grief, because we all know that famous word rumination is just going through your mind. You're going over the story, and the story just keeps coming and going and coming and going. And that's you grasping the reality of all this. So you start to recognize and validate your emotions. With grasping, you start going, okay, it's okay to feel this immense anger. It's okay to feel this immense sorrow. And you find yourself starting to express it a little bit more. And you start to seek, solace in that routine that you've started to create. Slowly, a routine starts to come. You may find yourself, so many people have said, I found myself in bed, not wanting to get up, not wanting to move, not wanting to do anything. And what happens with that is usually a friend or a loved one comes walking through the door and says, why don't we get up? Why don't we start a routine? And that is you trying to grasp all of this and go, yeah, I, you know, it's it's insane what's happening to me. So you reach out for support, or that support comes to you. You start to reflect on your relationship again. So if you notice, when we talk about stages of grief, I like to kind of use processing because that integration, they kind of flow into each other. Because, as we look at denial and we pull back, we start reflecting. In grasping, we start reflecting again on the story. We go back to our relationship with this loved one again. We start identifying triggers as we start grasping. We start noticing that song makes me think of my loved one. Seeing or doing that activity makes me think of my loved one. And then we start to accept that grief is really complicated. We start to say to ourselves, how do I do this? Like, this is so complex. It's multifaceted. And it's like you've been introduced to a whole new world that you truly did not ever want to see, but you're seeing it. And there's no way out except through. So, practical tools for processing grief. And we've seen this journaling, and why that seems to be kind of one of the number one things that a lot of people have shared over the last year. They've all written books. And again, that goes back to Together We Grieve. We want to share our story. We want to be able to express to others because we've been so profoundly impacted that you want to share your story. You want to say to others, truly, you can survive this. And when we put it to paper, this is why libraries and books will never leave. When we start writing with our physical hand, it retains in here. When we start sharing our story, I've seen it over and over, and you've witnessed it by listening to Grief Uprooted. It starts to process, it starts to affect us emotionally, spiritually, and physically. Our story starts to unravel. We become creative in our expression. Some people will use art, some people will use music, some people will use dance. We start to realize that all of this inside of us that we're trying to grasp is starting to explode. It's starting to come out. And how do we deal with that? How do we go, I can't contain what's inside of me anymore. I now have come to accept and understand this is happening to me. And I'm trying to grasp all these emotions I'm feeling, but I have no way of knowing what's coming. There's no roadmap. And there truly was no roadmap until today, until now. Because the roadmap you were given was for the dying. That's completely different than what you're experiencing today. That's why I'm so excited about 2024 and 2025 that's coming, because we now have a roadmap. We've evolved to understand this. And that's what's so amazing about this. And at any given time, and we all know this, that you want to seek out a friend or professional help or support through this, through coaching, recovery specialties, that's okay. Join a group, that's okay. Real life stories about grasping grief, episode 19. The journey behind all my life. The real journey behind all my life. To hear the full story, visit Grief Uprooted on the YouTube channel, episode 19. I love the YouTube because you get to witness our faces and kind of, you know, like I mentioned, I hear all these stories with you. That was one of the research things I wanted to do with Grief Uprooted. I wanted to be able to witness these stories together with you and let it all organically grow from there so that together we can understand this and we can kind of grasp and guide ourselves. And it was great to have those professionals kind of sprinkled in there with individuals who have written books, who have done turn their lives completely around after experiencing grief, because it guided us through. But the episode I'm talking about is episode 19. And In All My Life by Universal Pictures, this is Jen Carter. This young lady was ready to marry Saul, and Universal Pictures actually did a movie which is called All My Life, and you can see it on Crave. I think it's on Netflix. And Jen honored us by coming on and talking about her experience and really the story behind All My Life. This Universal movie was made about her and Saul getting married, and Saul was diagnosed with cancer. But the episode 19, was about her first experience with grief. And that was her latest book about her sister Marie, and how her journey was through the hospital for sick kids, and how her sister had died. And then she went on with her grief and met Saul, and how Saul was diagnosed with cancer. And before it was actually, if I recall it right, so you can go listen to the episode, he dies the day they were actually to be married, and how her community and loved ones joined together to really provide an amazing wedding. The movie is amazing. I've watched it. Her episode 19, is amazing. And I'm happy to say that during this episode, Jen was pregnant, and she has now delivered her baby. And you can follow her on Instagram, Jen Carter. And She has a beautiful family now, absolutely beautiful. And she really talks about grasping grief and how her sister's death at at a young age had impacted her, but how Saul, um, that journey had also brought it back, and how there was a delay in that. And and that's one of the things with grief. It isn't something like you're going to go bang, 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 bang through all these stages. They can take decades, and that's okay. It's you and your journey. But this episode definitely shows how she grasps. And if you watch the movie, it also shows how she's grasping and how Saul is grasping the fact that he is dying. When we move on to the next stage, um, melancholy. And I understand that melancholy is not a word that is used a lot. Um, a lot of times in grief, and years ago, we would use depression, but there's such a distinct difference. Melancholy is a state of profound and often overwhelming stage that follows disbelief, and it kind of really blends with grasping. You may start to feel melancholy as you're grasping it. It is a great period of sorrow. That is so different than depressed. You give yourself permission to feel sad. You're suppressing or denying your emotions can prolong the grieving process. Melancholy is really a stage where you are in, and a lot of times we hear it on Grief Uprooted, and I've heard it in my clients for the last 24 years. They'll say, I'm not depressed. Like, I'm still getting up and doing my routine. I'm still getting up and eating. And they often don't want to use the word depression. And they're like, I can't explain it. And as time went on, it was melancholy. This is such a state of all consuming, difficult stage of sadness. It's a deep feeling of really nothing. And it's a really hard stage to process. And melancholy actually is a perfect word for it. And I do have to do a shout out to um, so many of the professionals I've had on, and so many of actually the teenagers I've had on, because this word came up. And as I brought it forward and started talking about it, I thought, deep sorrow, really deep sorrow. Interesting enough, Freud coined it way before the stages of grief came out as melancholy, a state of such great sorrow and sadness, but you were still moving through your life. So, some of the ways to again get through this would be again slowing yourself down and embracing those emotions, but also creating a safe space for those emotions and being able to go, I'm truly the creator of these emotions. And this one might be a very hard concept to get, but we have a choice on how to feel emotions. So when we close our eyes and we decide to create a space for ourselves to process our emotions, if we were to close our eyes and bring forth our loved one when we were at a joyous time with them, you'll start to feel this sensation in your physical body. You'll start to feel your eyes tear up, but in a sense of joy. If you were to close your eyes and bring in the funeral and seeing your loved one, you'll feel that physical sensation of great sadness, but you will also feel your eyes tear up. But it's a different feeling. And during melancholy, it's really important to create a space for you to understand what's happening, to integrate this, but to also feel this sense, I'm not going to say control, of integration. And one of the ways to do it is connecting with nature, being able to look that you were built for this. As crazy as you don't want to accept it, we were. We were built for life and death. And when you connect with nature and see the seasons, you see the lifespans of animals, you see how things come to life, but how they also die. You start to realize that this is a human condition. Melancholy is part of it. And we start to engage in rituals. Bring back a ritual or something that brings you comfort. So many times people will light candles. They will talk to their loved ones during this period because this period can feel like depression. And that is something we want to be able to navigate. The first year of grief is not considered a mental illness. It is considered the stages of integrating grief. And I'm using those words because we're in 2024, 2025 is coming, and it's okay to seek support in that first year. But I cannot tell you how many people call me up and go, I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do because they're like, I'll call somebody and say I'm grieving, and they'll say, well, how far are you into it? And that they'll say 5 months, 6 months. Oh, after about a year, if it's still there, then we accept you as a patient or a client. And I hope I've introduced you to individuals on Grief Uprooted who will walk that journey, including me, right from day one. Some will walk you through that as a death doula before you lose your loved one. The world is changing, so changing. And that is why the 7 stages of grief are changing. They have to for our new world. But that's why it's so hard that first year. So when we look at melancholy, I really want to reflect on some of the things that we want to really pay attention to. Reflect on your memories. Learn that you have that ability to pull great memories forward, happy ones, but you also have that ability to pull sad ones forward. And that's okay. That's truly okay. You follow those emotions and consider your feelings while you're doing this. Take the time to explore this. Also find meaning. The meaning in your loved one's life and relationship with you. What would they be wanting for you right now? And then journal those thoughts. So many times people have come on and really have expressed their journals, shared their journals with us that have helped so many and became award-winning books. These people have become left their careers and became authors, traveling around, speaking about their book and teaching about grief. Our experiences are to be shared. Cry when you need to. It is okay to express those emotions. And we all know healthy ways of doing it. You know, if we have that immense anger, so many of us do. Get out on a basketball court, get into a room and scream it out by yourself if you need to. There's so many different ways to express ourselves and all the emotions that we have. Talk about your loved one. In melancholy, sometimes we fall to this depression and we start saying, hey, is it okay to share this? For sure, it's okay to share your sadness, but it's okay to share your happy memories also too. Engage in that creativity. Physical activity also is so, um, we have to remember the physical body is going through this too. As your mind is processing, your emotions and your spirit is trying to figure out this all, and your physical body is trying to keep you going. It's trying to fuel you. Um, we want to find moments of peace. With melancholy, it can feel so overwhelming. And I think that's perhaps why um, we have, or in the past, people have coined it as depression. But with melancholy, it's like I guess you could call, how they call pneumonia, you have walking pneumonia. I feel like melancholy is like walking depression. You're still moving, you're still capable of functioning, um, and you're trying to figure out what you're feeling. And with melancholy, we want to practice the mindfulness, seek the joy in those small things, and really start engaging with your family again, your loved ones. Engage in some self care. And this is when we really want to have some compassion. So, one of the episodes that really hit me about um, melancholy was Sorry for Your Loss, episode 23. Angie Hansen, whose sorrow and grief was so heavy after the loss of her 1 year old son, Garrett, and each day became such a struggle for her. And Angie was confronted with another devastating blow, the death of her husband. Her grief carried such an edge of anger. And I remember she introducing me to the term when she went on to create greeting cards. And she started to really express her grief like this because we really talked about what people were saying to her while she was in this state of melancholy. And when she said, I wanted to throat punch them all, I just, I remember thinking, wow, you have found a way to express your grief with humor, but also in a way that helped other people. To buy grief cards for other individuals that were so vividly honest and expressive was really good. Angie's episode, I do have to say that um, I remember being at the diner. I love to go to a diner with my parents every Thursday, and somebody come running up and said, I loved Angie Hansen. I loved her episode, again, episode 23. Um, they were talking about her and how she really took her grief in those depths of sadness and really started to become super creative in it, which turned out to be now a very successful greeting card company that came out of her melancholy. Number four, the realizations. It's like your perspective has shifted to reality and realization in grief, and that is stage four or process four, realization. It's like you just all of a sudden had a jar open and this shift starts coming. Also been coined a paradigm shift that the fog begins to start to lift and your perspective of life starts shifting. And the acknowledgement of your loved one starts to become a reality that this person has really died. In realization of grief, we start facing reality. We start dealing with the loneliness that starts to set in. We start realizing that person is gone. And, I just want to add here because so many times people say to me, how come when my grandparent died, or my sibling died when I was an adult, or a parent died, it didn't affect me as much as when my dog died? In this stage, the realization, one of the things about grief is that it compounds itself, but also how is that individual that you love, including animals, how is their loss or them no longer being in your daily life affecting you? The dog is more impactful because every morning you woke up and looked at the dog. You looked at your pet. They were part of your life every day. This is when we look at the loss of a child. They're part of your life every day. Not to lessen the grief of a grandparent, a sibling, or a parent, but how did they affect your life, your daily life? How does that incorporate into who you are now? So you start managing guilt. You start navigating that daily life going, okay, that person is not here. That pet is not here. What do I do with my days now? If you went for lunch every Saturday with a friend and that friend died, what do you do on Saturday now? That's the impact that we start to go with those realizations of grief. So we need to find that meaning again. And that's what starts happening in this paradigm shift in realizations. We start finding meaning. We start finding comfort and going, that's the meaning of this. This is why this might be happening to me. And it's unfortunate. Nothing in life justifies what you're experiencing. I'll tell you that right now. But we start to go, okay, I'm starting to realize that this is going to be permanent and part of my life. We start to feel this building of resilience in us. We start to feel, and it comes in and out. It's kind of like grasping falls in here and denial falls in here. And that's the difference in 2024 and 2025 compared back to 70s and 80s. We start to realize that these things continuously flow like a river. They start flowing in. And as you keep moving through your grief, these other things start flowing in. But you might all of a sudden go, whoa, I'm trying to grasp this, trying to understand this. You're creating that new routine, and the realizations start to come. Again, we want to practice self compassion. We always want to be able to seek professional help if we need it, but we need to engage in reflective practices. So, as the other ones, we're taking time for ourselves, we're allowing our emotions to rise, we're allowing ourselves to realize that we do have control over our emotions. But now we want to do reflective practices, such as, you know, honoring our loved ones, being able to start to say, I want to continue to light that candle and say good morning to my wife, even though she's not here every day. Start to set small goals for ourselves. Maybe we want to go out and buy a new candle, maybe a scent that would warm our house a little bit more. And they're manageable goals, they're not overwhelming goals. Maybe I just want to do one step towards going out to the diner or the restaurant that I used to go with my wife and just go have a coffee and realize there's no time frame that, society puts a time frame. After a year, if you're still grieving, that's not true. You will spend your life grieving. And you know that because you're listening to this right now and you 100% know it does not leave, it does not go anywhere. It integrates into this. And that's why we have to walk through this together. And we have to be able to set those little goals for ourselves and we have to be able to connect with each other. So, the episode that definitely does realization of grief is Men in Grief. On my YouTube channel, episode 24. The realization of grief is so powerful. The moment when emotions can erupt without warning. Jason, the father of a terminally ill son named Zachary, he vividly recounts the drive to the hospital on that day. His son passes away right before his eyes, despite knowing that Zachary might die and he will outlive him. He comes to the realization that he needed to integrate Zachary's memory. And he begins a significant changes and uncovering the man that he truly was meant to be. This Zachary has become such a part of Jason's life and part of so many other people's lives. He created a movement with Zachary. He is capable of helping and understanding his anger. Um, this was such a great episode because Jason was capable of coming to the realization that anger was okay. That's such a difficult emotion. And in episode 24, Zachary just, you know, Zachary meant so much to Jason, and his life was taking care of him. And that moment that he witnessed his son, I will tell you, it's quite a horrific story of finally getting his son to the hospital and then having to deliver those death notifications. Oh, I give myself goosebumps just reflecting on this to his family. But as a man and grieving, he really taps in to the realization and the meaning of the anger and melancholy and the disbelief and grasping of the whole process. Um, it's an excellent episode. So, episode 24. Number 5, this is clarity and grief. I know that you're saying, what? I do not feel clear on anything that's happening to me. Take into consideration even if we were to encapsulate this into 1 year, which is 12 months, clarity starts to kind of peek through. Is clarity is the sense of finding a new perspective of normalcy. We start to see the fog of intense emotions, of that state of melancholy. It starts to emerge and it gradually easing that emotional turmoil we're feeling inside. The dominance of those early stages, the denial, the grasping, the melancholy, the realizations. Realizations at time can feel like the jar opening and boom, 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 boom. These things start clicking. But all of a sudden, during this time, we're finding this new normal. And we start to find clarity and an understanding of what's taken place. I know you don't like it. I know you don't want it to happen. You want it to go away. But the clarity is it's here and it's happening. And during this time, if you notice through every stage and in every episode that we witnessed of people's real life grief stories, we could actually watch them and you will see where that individual is. And you would be able to, after listening to this, go, I see that that person was really in that state of melancholy, or that person is really still trying to grasp what happened to them. Um, we're establishing a new routine. We're establishing a new daily thing. It's gradually coming. And all of a sudden, in clarity, we start feeling a sense of stability, a sense of a little bit more control of what's taking place. We start to set realistic goals. Um, we start to discover another interest and hobbies. Or what's so interesting is you discover how people have new hobbies, that something came out of their grief, and all of a sudden they found that they were artistic and they start drawing all these photos, or they start really going for something that they've always wanted to do, such as be a singer or create music. In 2025, um, I very first guest, I'm not going to let this out of the bag, but he really uses his ability to play music and create music to help people grieve. He realized the music and the harmony of life. And, we're creating new traditions, new daily routines. And this is where clarity starts to come in. But we also want to be able to step back and do that mindfulness, be able to allow ourselves to take a deep breath and just release, to be able to go, it's okay. You might all of a sudden find yourself wanting to look into yoga or Reiki or meditation in ways of grounding yourself because this new sense of who you are is starting to emerge. And you might be fighting it. And so many people, and I'm here to tell you it's okay, may spend a long time in one stage or even feel like they're stuck in a stage. Or how many times people will say, I think I hit acceptance. We're going to talk about this because is acceptance truly the word we want to use? Are we truly accepting that our loved one has died? Let's keep going. Because right now, we're sitting at that state of clarity where it's starting to really make more sense, I guess. And we're starting to realize, and I guess this is really the state of clarity, is that we need to prioritize ourselves. We need to start prioritizing rest. We need to get sleep. We just realized that we went through disbelief and grasping. That's when you never sleep. You just ruminate and you just keep going over and over and over and over and you keep talking about it. And then you hit this state of melancholy where you're like, I'm just bloody exhausted. And then when we come to those realizations and clarity starts to seep in, I need to take care of my body. I need to eat right. I need to drink water more. I need to pamper myself and understand that it's okay to feel this all. And I need to set boundaries. Maybe I need to protect my energy a little bit more. Maybe I need to not take care of everybody around me, but take care of myself. Maybe I feel like joining a support group. Maybe I want to talk to somebody. Maybe I can finally make that phone call to me, to Grief Uprooted. Maybe I could seek and join a group at a hospice or a funeral home. Or maybe I just want to go out and have coffee with my friends. Considering engaging again, the clarity is coming. Connect with community resources because we start realizing we're not alone. We start going, wow, grief has actually been an active part of our lives. All the songs we listen to, every year, the movies, they show everyone who has passed or died at our award ceremonies. Grief is there, but we just haven't had it really come to the depths of impacting us. And when it does impact us over and over and over again, we can get stuck. We can get stuck in living in disbelief. And then years down the road, we start realizing what's happening to me? Why am I all of a sudden reflecting on all of this? We start wanting to keep memories alive and we start focusing on finding some growth within us. We start seeing, wow, with this clarity, I'm starting to become more understanding. I'm starting not to jump and get excitable over things that are happening around me. That it really isn't a big deal if things aren't perfect. And one of the stories is episode 27. A father's wish made medical assistance in dying. Wow. Um, you know, when I met Victoria, she's a death doula, and she stood so firm in helping her father with that choice of made medical assistance in dying. And she really struggled because her mother did not want to know and did not support her father's choice in a medical assistance in dying. She didn't support MAID. And here's a child of this man, even though she's an adult, you know, she talks about how her grief kept evolving and she just didn't understand what was happening. And through her time of grieving after her father died, and truly after her mother died, and that she had to go to her mother and not share the truth that she assisted her father in dying. Wow. Like, wow. The things her mind went through and how clarity started to come through and how she processed all of this. One is truly denial or disbelief in the beginning that her father even wanted to do this. And then the disbelief that her mother would not support this. And she starts to talk about how this clarity works and how this journey through grief brought her closer, not only to herself, but to her loved ones and a more fulfilling life. Episode 27, it's called A Father's Wish Made Medical Assistance in Dying. And Victoria, she really brings you through it and a new understanding of how fragile and fleeting life can be. But it's how she was so empowered to reshape her life, um, and one that honors herself, her father, her mother, and her loved ones, and really how she moved on with a clearer picture. It's truly an excellent episode, episode 27. And then we move into 6. We're very close to finally moving to this last stage. But number 6, compassion. You may find yourself becoming more attuned to the struggles of those around you. The heightened sensitivity is a testament to the transformative power of grief. Through all the episodes, this was one thing that we really have to look at. with the 7 stages or 5 stages of grief created in the 70s and 80s. That individual and those 7 or 5 stages of grief were created for the dying, not for the living. And we're following them. We're reading all these books and going, yes, this is what they created in the 70s and 80s. And we're grasping onto this. That person died. So they need to come to acceptance of death. But are you needing to come to an acceptance of death? No, you're not, because you're not dying. You're living. You need to come to compassion in grief. You need to come to a state where you realize in that clarity that you have the ability to be not only compassionate to yourself, but to others. This was really the core of Grief Uprooted when I started doing it. And I started to see it emerge in like episode 30 to 40. The compassion people had for another in grief, it was amazing. It was like you would go, I found my people. These people saw things so drastically different. We couldn't really engage in today's world. It wasn't like you could go and say, I care about what I'm eating at 5 o'clock now. It's always something that I always found entertaining because people would say, what are you going to eat for supper? And I never worried about what I was going to eat for supper at 8 a.m. in the morning because I was like, something could happen today that changes the whole directory of my life. I'll worry about what I'm going to eat at 5 o'clock when 5 o'clock comes. And that's where we have truly, society has failed the grieving when we're handing you a manual that is for someone who's dying. You're not to accept this. You will not accept this. It's not in your ability to accept this. But what's in your ability is to have compassion for yourself and others. You have no choice but to integrate and I guess say accept that your loved one is dead. But you're not dying. So throw out the word acceptance. Please throw out the word acceptance and replace it with compassion. With compassion for yourself and compassion for the other people in your world. And the compassion to go, there's a whole other world out there with a whole lot of other realizations. And you have just survived the most horrific thing in your life. You're doing it right now. The emergence of compassion is natural, it's organic, and it is something that happens when we experience this ability to share our own vulnerability and pain. It's an understanding of the depths of sorrow. It makes you more empathetic towards others, and it breaks down these barriers that really kept you in solitary because you were always afraid to say something. You were always afraid to do something. You start to realize that you can acknowledge pain. What's really interesting about compassion, it's like this gift is given to you that you have this ability to see. I remember just after experiencing it, and I often talk about it, that I can seek out or recognize somebody who's grieving. I can be out and all of a sudden realize that person is grieving. And that is really what compassion does. When you start to be able to have that compassion for yourself, you'll see some of the guests we had on. They had this ability to help other people. And they were like, I don't understand how I'm so empathetic towards that person. This is why during some of the grief courses and programs that I've developed and in the training, people always say to me, well, I don't have education. I say, if you have experienced grief, you have empathy, you have compassion. I can't teach you that. No one can teach you grief. You can't read it out of a book and go, okay, now I can help grieving people. It doesn't work that way. This is something in our lives we have to experience. It's like trying to explain to someone how to give birth. You can say, this is what happens. Just as we've been grasping onto an old idea of grief for somebody who's dying, we can say, here, this is how you give birth. These are things you can do to help you. But that's evolving. That's so evolving. We can't explain to someone when they're giving birth what that pain truly feels like. We can't explain what comes the days after they've given birth. They have to do it themselves, and that is grief. It is something that you experience that changes you, profoundly changes you. The first thing we start to do with compassion is acknowledging our own pain, but acknowledging others. We start doing self-kindness, but you'll see yourself reaching out to those whom you may think is experiencing grief or they have in the past. You'll see yourself with this understanding that you truly never had. Your mindfulness starts to really engage. You don't give a crap about tomorrow. You start to want to live in the present. You start to want to do things and engage in things. I have had people I've worked with who've up and up just packed and moved somewhere else and are living this life that they always dreamed of because now this compassion and realizations all came into play and they went, I need to do me. And in turn, that will help so many others. Another part of this compassion is self-forgiveness. We, so many times during all of this, you're going to have those emotions. So when we look at the 7 stages of grief, it doesn't talk about emotions. And the reason the old practice never did from the 70s and 80s, because that person was dying. They were dying. Again, you're not dying. So you're dealing with this bag of emotions. How many times people call me up and go, how come we don't talk about like sadness, happiness, self-blame, joy, anger? All of that isn't in that. And I'm like, because the person they were focused on and the study they focused on was the dying. You are the living. And with living comes this bag of emotions. And what we've learned is that we can recall or suppress those emotions. You know you can. That's why we talk about the jar. All of a sudden, somebody has suppressed, and then the jar pops open and all these emotions come out. Or there's people that are ruminating and the emotions are flowing and they don't know what to do. But all of a sudden, this all starts to fall in line. And when we get to this place of compassion, it's truly, it is a great place to be. It's nowhere near what it was like when your loved one was alive. But again, we don't get an option whether to grieve or not. It doesn't care. Grief is the only thing in life that doesn't discriminate. Does not care what color your skin is. It doesn't care how wealthy you are. It doesn't care how famous you are. It's the only thing that equalizes all of us. And then when you get to this compassion, you start to see that equalization. And we start actively listening to other stories. And we start offering some bits and pieces of advice, like how we could help somebody else. We start sharing our story a little more. And we start talking about our loved one a little bit more. And sometimes we may want to volunteer or help out. And there's such a connection with this compassion to empathy. And with empathy, we start putting yourself in someone else's shoes now. It's the best way to describe empathy is you now have experienced and gone through something horrific. I wish I had another word for horrific, but it it has profoundly changed you. You are no longer the person you were before. And you start looking at others and going, wow, I can only imagine what it's like to experience that. This is when you start watching commercials and you start to cry because there's this compassion and empathy that clicks in now that you're like, what is this? And that's that experience of grief. You start to create empathetic relationships. You foster relationships that are really intimate in the emotions. And when we talk about that, that intimacy comes from vulnerability, sharing your grief with another. That's why Grief Uprooted is such an honor because this person is coming on to share their story with me. And it's so vulnerable. And they're willing to do that. And why are they willing to do that? Why are they willing to come on here and share their story? Because they have compassion. They've went through these 7 stages of grief and they didn't die. They're alive. That's why these stages need to be embraced. Compassion comes because we're alive. Emotions come because we're alive. And they want to share. They want to be able to help others. You start reducing isolation when compassion starts coming. You start to feel this emotional resilience. And that can be kind of like, it's kind of like your mind. You're like, whoa, I can actually pull myself from great sadness and pull in a memory of happiness. You start to do a self-talk where you can go, you know what? I need to talk to myself. I need to tell myself that it's okay. It's truly okay to be experiencing this. And, you know, it's okay to be experiencing this and being able to have a sense of control of it. Um, I think that's kind of where the mind thing comes in because you start to go, I'm talking to myself. And then you start realizing, wow, what was my past experiences with grief? And that's where you really start to explore emotional resiliency. You start to explore your past. And, you know, it's been coined your inner child, your unconsciousness. And grief brings that. Grief brings this sense of, you know, can my loved one see me? Can they talk to me? Can I talk to my loved one? What was my experience with grief as a child? This whole self reflection comes into play. And you start having compassion and you start realizing the very conversation that you are having with your inner self, your unconsciousness, is the conversation you're having with this universe. It's really predicting or navigating or laying out the path you need by where your thoughts are going. This is the amazing part of grief. This is what Grief Uprooted truly taught people, that there is this growth happening within you. As horrible as your grief feels, this growth is happening. You don't see it. But because you're living, not dying, you don't reach acceptance. Who wants to accept this? Not me. And I'm sure you don't. But you want to feel this compassion for yourself, this compassion for others. And you want to feel this emotional resilience within yourself. You want to come to this realization with clarity and compassion and this emotional resilience. You start wanting to look at your physical health and go, how is my grief affecting me physically? Am I an emotional eater? I don't know. But you start exploring all of this when you start having this compassion for yourself. One of the best episodes, I know I may have went on a tangent there because compassion to me is such a pivotal point, um, was Nancy, an meet Nancy, an athlete who allowed her grief to ignite healing within others. This is episode 11. Um, and Nancy was a young mother who brought a son into the world who, um, unimaginable, terminal illness. And she embodied compassion in everything she does. She had lived at Ronald McDonald House in Toronto. And during this time with her son, so many surgeries, so many times being prepared um, for the death of her son. She spent 100 days at Ronald McDonald House. She started in Toronto, and she came from a smaller area, not full of all these people. She moves and picks up her whole family to live at Ronald McDonald House in Toronto for 100 days. And during this time, she really starts going, how do I survive this? This grief, she is sitting in the midst of it. And it's anticipatory grief, right? Is he going to die in this surgery? Is he going to die tomorrow? Will I walk in and he die? How will I take care of my other child and my husband? And during this episode, um, I remember halfway through her going, "Oh, Christine." And she's just like, "You're making me cry." But, she was still within that grief. And she started running in the city of Toronto. Every morning got up and ran and ran. And she started to see how grief physically started to affect her. And her compassion for herself and her family started to grow. But what also seemed to grow was she started raising money for Make-A-Wish Foundation, for the Hospital for Sick Kids, over $25,000 raised for charities by using her physical body, by saying, I'm going to use my physical body. I'm going to take care of it. I'm going to have compassion for it. I'm going to understand its grieving. And I'm going to use that to show other people that there's strength within me. And I have compassion and empathy for those who are going through the same thing I'm going through. It's really, she ends up in 2020 swimming the Welland Canal, like the whole canal, and continues to this day to raise money for those who are grieving and for those who are going through the very same thing you and I are going through. So, really, episode 11, Meet Nancy. Amazing, amazing episode. And she shares her whole journey on there of stories of having that compassion. And one of the things in compassion is, those acts of kindness, our breathing, compassionate imagery, being able to pull forward some of the positive memories we have, and living with a purpose. We start to see that happening, and you'll see that in Nancy's. She really has a purpose for her life now. Um, Even though, she has a job and she still feels this meaningful purpose to help others and have this compassion for others and continues to raise money and advocate for others. This is a stage of grief. Obviously, if we were dying, would not be part of it. But it's a stage of grief that is just a glimmer of hope. It's you realizing that you might just survive this. You will be transformed greatly. But there are others out there that need your help. And you have a gift to give to others. We start self reflecting. I'm going to take you in to the last stage of grief for a living human being. And this stage is by far a stage that we've all witnessed on Grief Uprooted: resilience in grief. To me, this is the final stage of grief. When you realize that you have walked through disbelief, you've walked through grasping, you've walked through melancholy, you've walked through realizations you never thought you'd have, nor maybe didn't want to have. When you've come to this clarity, perhaps that you didn't want to accept that people and things will live and die. And then you have this compassion for yourself and start going, how come I am starting to look at other people and have this weird empathy for them? Resiliency is the ability to adapt and to recover from adversity. In the context of grief, it means finding your way to honor our loved ones while continuing to engage in life. It's about bouncing back, not by returning to where we were before, not by going, I accept this happened to me. No, it's about growing. It's about growing into someone who can carry their grief, who can honor their grief, who can integrate their grief and find the joy and purpose of their life. Their life, not their death, their life. We're starting to find hope. We're starting to find hope that, we're resilient. We're strong. We can do this. We start to see new life. We start to see grandbabies come. We start to see perhaps a new pet. We start to see that there is still life. As sad and as horrific the experience we have had, we start to see that we're resilient. We start embracing change. We start looking at things so differently. And the best part, we start developing a purpose for who we are and why we're here. Some tips for this stage or going through resilience is set those realistic goals. Maintain that connection to your loved one and your close friendships. Again, we still want to take care of our health. We still want to practice self-compassion. We still need to seek that help if we need it. Engage in meaningful activities and rituals. But the most important thing, and if you want to keep acceptance here, accept you're resilient, that you're doing it, that you can do it. The opposite of grief is great love. You would not be grieving or listening to this episode unless you loved someone beyond bounds. And guess what? You did. That's why you're grieving. So many times in Grief Uprooted, we watched people's lives just change drastically. And an example of resilience is John Denver, episode 34. He turned to TikTok when he was diagnosed with cancer. And it garnered over 1 million views. And when John reached out, he said, I went into the doctor's office and they looked at me and said, You have cancer. And, he said, I just sat in my car and I recorded myself saying, I have to go home and tell my wife I have cancer. And that vulnerability that he displayed, over 1 million people stood to support him. There are people out there that want to love and care and support you, and they don't even know you. That's what grief is. That's what it is. Another, Stephen Painas, episode 30. He worked with the Super Bowl, Indy 500 legends, you know, and the death of his 16-year-old son, Jake. And he recounts how he stood with his other son in front of a tree talking about bark and how new life in the years that this tree had been here. This took a man who was in this corporate world, in this fast-paced world, working with, Super Bowl, Indy 500, famous people, down to quitting that job and devoting his life to becoming a writer, to focusing in on that family. These two men realized that resilience wasn't about money. It wasn't about having this amazing job. It was seeing and realizing how amazing of human beings they were, how resilient they were. Yes, both men still walk, struggling, and was probably flowing in and out of all these stages of grief. But both episode 30, Stephen, and episode 34, John, both have gone down this journey to come to this place of resilience. And in resilience, we start to honor our loved one more. We open our hearts up to experiencing joy. We start to create new traditions. And the biggest, we focus on growth. We cultivate a hopeful outlook, believe in possibilities of positive experiences coming our way. If we were to come in an acceptance, it would be an acceptance of this journey. Grief is a lifelong journey. It has its ups, it has its downs, and that is part of who we are. We celebrate our strengths. We're open to change. We support others. And really, the best, we live with a purpose. We find ways to live our lives more purposeful. Resilience is a profound gift that emerges from the depths of sorrow and loss. We are not here to go through the 7 stages of grief for someone who is dying. Today, we are here to look at the 7 stages of grief for you, the living. Grief Uprooted truly was an idea that I had, that I didn't really know what the path was going to be like, what the journey was going to be like. But through this journey came the 7 stages of grief. And these 7 stages are for you, the living. For you, who is still in the depths of their grief. Resilience. That's what we are. We're resilient. And you are resilient. I just have to say a huge, heartful thank you to all of my guests, over 50 guests. I think we're headed into the 60s, for coming on here and being so vulnerable and sharing their their stories with us and walking us through disbelief and grief, grasping of grief, melancholy and grief, realization and grief, the clarity and grief, compassion and grief, and until our final stage, resilience and grief. I I really can't thank enough all the professionals who came on to argue and review and explore all the traditional ways we grieve, and then to offer great new ways we grieve. And out of all of this has come these 7 stages of grief for the living, from grief to growth. And, you know, just having these practical steps to embrace resilience is to set realistic goals, maintain our connections, take care of you, practice self compassion, always seek that help if you need it. And most of all, let's really realize that through all these stages, we understand our purpose. We create a purpose for who we are, and that you are doing it. There's no, I don't know how to grieve. I can't grieve. You are grieving. You're in the depths of it and you're doing it. I thank you all for such an amazing year. I thank you all for everything that you have done to support me on social media, and all my guests. And I am super, super, super excited for 2025. There's an amazing lineup of guests that are coming, and a few new books, I think, because the 7 stages of grief for you in 2024 and 2025, it's about grieving together, because it is only together that we grieve, and it is only together that we heal. Take care, everybody. I'll see you in 2025. Bye. Grief Uprooted professional grief and empowerment coaching are not to be used as a substitute for professional advice by legal, medical, financial, business, spiritual, or other qualified professionals. All our products and services are designed for grief empowerment through learning and sharing of one's lived experiences.